So, Mike, thanks a million for coming on the podcast. Your book, War by Necessity, is out, and I suppose it's a grim tale of what you and your family had to go through. I don't want to give away too much yet because we're going to go into your story, but you know your dad murdered 2013. Like it must have taken some burden on yourself and your family. I know in the book, Mike, you almost go through chronologically through the case, uh, and it's almost inviting readers, online sleuths, anyone that might have information to try pique their interest and recall and maybe get some sort of leads. So I suppose, do you want to give a bit of background about who you are, and then maybe we'll go into the case and going in it from that chronological perspective?
Sure. So great to be here. And even though it is a tough topic, my name is Mike Gatto, and I served in the California legislature. I guess in European terms, right? Someone would say it's like a regional parliament, but I was in the California legislature. I represented 500,000 people in a district that was centered in Hollywood, California. And what we're about to discuss today is one of those, Los Angeles murder mysteries that, for whatever reason, have been part of Los Angeles history for a long time. Unfortunately, this one, of course, involves my father. I was in my third year of office when we got a phone call on November 13 of 2013. And the phone call was from my sister, and she, reached me late at night in my house in the Capitol and told me that she had gone over to my father's house and that she thought he was dead. Now, this was something that was very shocking to me as I wrote in the book, because my father was in peak health. He was an old Italian man, but he was, one of those guys who gardens every day. And I talk in the book about how he could deadlift refrigerators and stuff like that. I mean, he was in the peak of health, and he was somebody that, we thought would live till 100, 120, And so my first reaction was disbelief. And from that moment, my life, or our life in our family, was completely turned upside down.
Yeah, I can imagine. Horrific. But even to go back in there, Mike. So your sister arrives at the house. Like, what did she see? Like, was it ransacked? Was it in pristine? Was there doors open? Like, what scene did she come across as she arrived at your dad's house?
Great question. So as you noted, the book is laid out chronologically. I wrote the book for two reasons. Number one was to give people a little sense of what it's like to go through something like this. We often, talk about crime and stuff like that, but I wanted to speak up for all the victims of crime out there, victims of murder specifically, who are still waiting for answers, and to make sure that the public focuses on things like that. I also have a very selfish hope, which is that readers would pick up the book and they would sort through the clues. And because I don't hold anything back. I mean, I go in chronological order of everything that I learned as I learned it, and see, if it can develop the mindset of some of, your viewers, because I think a lot of people out there have a lot to offer, whether it's DNA expertise or, just crime solving expertise. So the initial reports that we got back, and this is both from my sister, the paramedics on site, the police on site, my friends who I had drive over there, was that there was no signs of forced entry, that my father had been shot by a single gunshot. The point of entry appeared to have been his torso, and the bullet lodged in his thigh, and it seems like he bled out. He bled to death. There was not much blood on the floor, is my understanding, but a lot of it pooled inside of his body, and that is what caused him to pass away. There was limited ransacking. There was a wooden file cabinet that had been hacked into. There was some attempts to get into a safe or some safes, but the attempts, as I later talk about, were ridiculous. It was like, you would never do this unless, there was something seriously wrong with you, or you were a very stupid person. And so we basically concluded over time, and I don't want to, prejudice, people who might be trying to solve the crime, but we either said that the way that things were done, it was either that the perpetrator was really, really stupid and maybe high on drugs, or they were trying to stage things and make it look like they had ransacked things, because there was a lot of valuables that were left. And the focus in the and the house seemed to have been a little bit strange.
Yeah, and Mike, to go back there, okay, so what room of the house are we in where your dad is and where these wooden filing cabinets are?
Yeah, great. So my father lived in a Los Angeles neighborhood called Silver Lake, and people think of Los Angeles as having palm trees and nothing but
Sure.
but there's actually a little lake in it's a man-made lake in Los Angeles, but there's a little lake in Silver Lake, and it's 2.5 miles around, and my father's house was very close to it, and the and he had a three-story house, and he was found in his bedroom, the master bedroom, which was on the third floor of the three-story house. And he was found slumped at his desk. And that was the room that was ransacked. There was nothing else in the house, as far as we know, that was disturbed, taken, looked at, touched. I mean, that's what's kind of hard to believe is my father was a collector. He had a big three-story house in a nice neighborhood of Los Angeles, and he had a lot of things that were worth a lot of money. But the only room that was focused on was his own bedroom.
Okay, his home bedroom, and that's where, like, so none of the really rest of the house was ransacked. I suppose that's the wrong word, but like,
Right. Yeah,
rifled through maybe.
precisely. Nothing in the garage. He had valuable tools. Nothing on the walls. He had valuable artwork on the walls throughout the whole house. It was very, very strange to us. Whoever killed him focused solely on his bedroom.
How many, like, just out of curiosity, like, how many bedrooms are? Because I know from the book, it was up on the third floor.
Or yeah,
Like, to get up, if you're coming in from the bottom, it's a long way to go up, and you're probably
right.
passing valuables throughout the house. Like, if it's a burglar. Like, but yeah, sorry, how many rooms? Like, is it like, is it
Yeah,
a
it
big
was
big
a
enough house?
pretty good size four-bedroom
Yeah.
house, and that is one of the things that I started to notice. I quickly started to notice anomalies in the behavior of whoever did this, right? The first one was that my father had three cars. Again, European viewers might laugh. I'm like, what's a single man, in Los Angeles doing with three cars? But he had three cars. One of them was a classic car that he never drove. And then he had two cars he drove. One was small that he drove for small things, and one was big where he hauled stuff in. And they're all in driveway. They're all parked in his house. And as I don't remember how I phrased it in the book, but as I phrased it like whoever, if the perpetrator did not know him, they didn't know, did he have, three sons, the Ukrainian wrestling team? I mean, like who was living at this house besides him, right? And it is very, very weird for somebody to enter an inhabited dwelling like that, where there's three cars and, maybe lights on and things like that. So we thought that was some weird behavior, and then go up to the third floor.
And what time of the day is this at? Or do they estimate it?
Yeah, so they estimate that my father was killed at roughly 7:37 p.m. They base that estimate on the fact that they know that he left a store, an electronics store, that was about 10 minutes away at about 6 o'clock, if I remember correctly. And they know that because they found a receipt for a printer that he had bought. And then they went there and they got the security video, and they showed him pushing his cart out of the store with a printer. Then there's this weird gap where we don't know where my dad was, right? And then there's this other period where it appears that he or somebody was active on his computer. And that last activity was about 7:37 p.m. And so we don't have the answers, but we believe he was killed sometime in the early evening of November 12th. So he was discovered on the 13th, but he was killed on the 12th.
And so if this is, like, let's even, like, because I know there's a few different maybe theories, but like if it's a home invasion, like would it be bright in LA in Silver Lakes around that time, like say between 6 and 7:30, or was it like dusky, getting dark?
Yeah, it's amazing you mentioned that, because I actually pulled an almanac to find out the exact time of sundown and dusk and everything in Los Angeles then, and which has also switched because we've switched the daylight savings since then in California. But the answer is that it would have been starting to get dark. It would have been not pitch black yet, but it would have been pretty darn dark at that point. We don't have that much sunlight during November in Los Angeles. I mean, we have a lot, but the weird thing is, and I talk about this, and it's the theory that originally emerged, or the second theory that emerged, is that this idea that this was connected to a car burglary that was happening right as people came home from work and school. That part to me has always been so strange.
Yeah, and even to give a bit more detail on that, Mike, because I know in the book and stuff you go through it where one woman was threatened.
Yes. So the initial theory that came out was that my father was killed by the Russian mafia, right? And that stemmed from one neighbor who had known that there was a local antiquarian society that had put out a flyer a couple days before. And the flyer read something like, Joe Gatto is going to appear at our antiquarian society, in this little neighborhood, and he's going to bring some of his wonderful collection of Russian paintings. It's a certain distinct type of Russian and Greek Byzantine paintings. Now, I should say that these paintings were valuable, like they were worth $2,000 or $3,000 each, but they're not Van Goghs. They're not worth millions, right? But the neighbor had that flyer and initially told the media, well, gee, the killer probably thought he was going to go to storage, get all these valuable paintings, and that they'd be in the house and they were looking for them. Well, that was quickly dismissed by the police because, there were ones on the wall that, whoever had been there had walked right by. Okay. The second theory that I had was that this was political in some way. I was at the peak of my power in California. California is a very big state. We have 40 million people. There's a lot at stake in what we do in the legislature. I was concerned that someone was trying to send me a message. The police have also dismissed that in large part. They said, Mike, you're a very public person. Everybody knew where you lived. You had two houses in Southern California, one in Sacramento. They were very public. They would have just killed you if they want to send you a message. I said, oh, that's lovely, but thank you. Okay, at least that checks that off. The third theory that emerged, and this one dominated things for about 6 years, was there was a woman coming home from karate class with her son, and she saw a guy breaking into cars. Like, this is now broad daylight. This is like 4 or 5 o'clock. She sees a guy breaking into cars, like breaking windows and taking stuff out. And by the way, this isn't a nice residential neighborhood, right? This isn't like a downtown area. And she summoned a male neighbor. They confronted this guy. He allegedly said something like, well, if you follow me, I'm going to kill you. But then he ran away and they then followed him. So they weren't that scared. And then her son, who was very young at the time, 6, 7, 8 years old, thought that he saw a gun, thought that he saw that the guy had a gun. So the theory was that this was the person connected with my father's.
What was he dressed like? Like, was he dressed like, say, a kind of more vagrant style? Did he just look like a normal person? What was his dress or demeanor?
Great question. So I actually did, my own independent interviews of both of the adults who saw the person. I wanted to know what they saw. I wanted to try to augment what the police had talked about with them. And I was curious, right? The thing that really, really troubled me is both of them said something like, he looked like an Eastern European hitman. And that to me was very troubling. They said he was dressed very nicely. He was not somebody who looked like he would be breaking into cars for a drug hit. And again, the anomalies started to hit with this theory almost immediately. First of all, the police's theory when they I said, give me a profile of this person. They said, well, okay, it's a guy, who's high on drugs and he needs a fix. And so he's breaking into cars. Well, wait a second. If he has a gun, why doesn't he just go and stick somebody up? I mean, this is a neighborhood where there's a bunch of wealthy people walking around the lake. It's like recreation. Just walk up and say, give me your purse, give me your wallet. And like, that's a lot quicker, a lot more direct than smashing into car windows, when people are coming home from work. Secondly, why is he dressed nice? Like, why is he wearing the sort of the track suit, the expensive leisure suit, that type of thing? But the police's theory was that he fled from these people. This is their profile, okay? He was right-handed, and people, when they're running and they're right-handed, they tend to turn right. So he went down this little walk street, then turned right. Then he saw my dad's street, which looked like an alley. Again, this is the police's assumption. Went down my dad's street to try to hide. At that exact moment in time, there was a tour helicopter dispatched to take tourists to the Hollywood sign. Happens a lot in the neighborhood that we were in.
Right.
And he thought it was a police helicopter. Again, this is their theory. And at that exact moment in time, my dad had walked out of his house and realized he could not get the printer out of his side door, so had to open the garage to get it out of the hatchback. And at that exact moment in time, as my dad's walking with the printer inside the house, he presses the button to close the garage door, and the guy ducks in, and that explains the no forced entry. Now, again, for this theory to work, with the timeline of the woman coming home, very precise, and the timeline of when we think my father got killed, based on the action on his computer, very precise. What that means is that this young man would have had to sit in my father's garage for an hour, not take anything, not take the cars, not go through the cars, not take the tools, just sit there for an hour. And like, he saw a person, right? So it's like, again, he doesn't know, is the whole family home? There's 3 cars. Does this guy have 7 6'5" sons who are home, right? Sits in the garage for about an hour. And then at some point decides to walk up to the 3rd floor of my dad's inhabited dwelling and shoot him. And that to me has always been the strangest theory in the world. And when I would say that to the police, they'd be like, well, it all makes sense if he was high on drugs. Yeah, I suppose. But, it still has really, really, really bothered me. Oh, and by the way, for this theory to work, he would have had to sit there and watch my father bleed to death after firing a gun in an inhabited dwelling, which is very loud, and you think everybody has heard it, and you probably want your impulses to run away. And so for me, it's just always been hard to accept that.
Yeah, and a few bits to unpack here. So number one, timeline seems a bit off there. If it was 4 o'clock and he's breaking and entering, and then again he'd run, your dad was coming back he was there, the timestamp at 6 o'clock in the hardware store. There's a lot of time there missing. Number two, if someone's high on drugs, I don't think they're going to have the almost mental capacity to sit around waiting. They're going to be amped up. No one's going to wait around an hour off their head on meth or something like that. They're going to be, they're going to be doing something active, And then number three, what's the goal here? Home invasions, the amount of home invasions where reported home invasions where murder, a homicide happens is less than 1%. It's so rare. People, we see movies and stuff like that where, someone breaks into a house and they kill someone. That's not the goal. The goal is to get money or get valuables or something and get out and
Precisely.
not get caught. It's so rare someone would kill someone. And then, as you say, the rifle through, to go back there, what was in, was there anything of valuable within these, number one, within the safe or within the wooden, filing cabinet? Was there anything there that was of special interest maybe?
Well, it's interesting because there's a lot that we don't know and there's a lot that I don't know. My father in his retirement had started to make jewelry. I should also stress, with the paintings, this was not platinum and diamonds. This was not engagement rings. This was very artistic jewelry using silver and gold and bits of little other artistic things. The rings would sell for a good amount, maybe $1,000, but if you melted them down, they were maybe worth $200. The silver one's $20. He had some of his jewelry, as far as we know, just in the room. And that, we believe, was taken because there was a bunch of little jewelry envelopes where somebody had rifled through and left them on the bed. So that is something that the perpetrator did get away with or made a show of trying to get away with. However, there was still other jewelry in the room and other valuables, brand new iPads and, things that you could fence pretty easily that were just not taken. They were just right there in front of the perpetrator and just not taken. I don't know what was in my dad's wooden file cabinet. I'm assuming it was files, but could he have also stored junk in there or valuables? Totally possible. It was locked, so whoever felt like they need to break in it, they broke in it. With respect to the safes, my dad had legitimate valuables in the safes, right? I mean, I'm sure that's where he kept gold and coins and things like that. But that was the other thing that was so weird. Whoever did this tried to break into the safes with a pair of garden scissors. And I want to stress that, if you've seen those Old West movies with those old Wells Fargo, Old West safes that are about the size of a human being and the walls are this thick.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's again, the person was either really, really stupid or really high on drugs, or they were making a big show of trying to get it. Because, you're not going to take one of those little hedge trimmers and you're not going to get anywhere with the safe. And they didn't get anywhere by trying to get in the safe.
So, Mike, honestly, what's your gut telling you about all this? What's the snap decision that you're getting in your gut when you're weighing up all this evidence? What's the initial thing you think of?
My gut tells me that there was something more to it. The reason why I believe that is to some degree, it's just based on the fact that nobody's been caught, right? Somebody who's young and high on drugs and fits that profile, they do two things. Number one, they reoffend. They get caught doing
100%.
something stupid, because they're stupid. Number two, they talk. A young man who like is rolling with a bad crowd and, someone takes a swing at him or someone insults him. He says, "Hey, I'm tough. I killed somebody." "Oh, who sure you did. Who'd you?" "Well, that guy in the news." "Oh, that was me." Like they talk. And the fact that nobody has talked, there's fingerprints and we think some DNA but nothing is matched, right? To me, that is a sign that there is something more to it. However, when I look at every theory, every single theory has problems. Okay. If you assume that this was like a hit, the police have said, well, the shot was not to the head. It was not to the heart. It was more to the torso. Now, my dad also tried to wrestle with the perpetrator. I just learned that. I learned that like 2 years ago. The police told me that there was some indication that he did fight back. Okay. So I don't know, that could throw the whole hit thing, right? Like someone was pointed at his head, maybe he went like this and then there was an accidental discharge. Okay. But the problem with the theory of a hit, an organized hit, is that the bullet entry wound was in his torso. The problem with the young kid high on drugs, I've already walked through those. The other main theory that the police have shared with me, or that my friends have talked about, is that could this have been like a business partner of my dad's or some old guy or, somebody who he knew and that he let in and everything like that, or that had somehow gotten access to his house, but then my dad came home and found the person. And that would change a lot. That would change would the person have had to sit there, would the person have had to come into an inhabited house? Okay, that takes that off. Would the person have to have discharged a gun and just been like, "Oh, I'm going to sit here for an hour and ransack," which is kind of weird too. Would the person have watched my father bleed to death? That takes all three of those off if he caught somebody. But it also is so hard for me to believe because, I don't know about you. My dad was not stupid. He didn't have a hero complex. If he came home and walked into his bedroom and found like, "Oh my God, there's my file cap's been hacked into. There's stuff all around." Most people are walking. They're these days they got their cell phone in their pocket. He would have just dialed 911 and walked out, right? I mean, he wouldn't have like sat down and like sat down at his desk and like started doing whatever. So every theory has a problem.
Yeah. Like, do you know what's springing to mind there as you're talking like that? Like, if I'm a 78-year-old man, like, I don't think I'm going to wrestle someone over like valuables. I think at that age of my life, I don't care. Take it. It's probably insured. I will wrestle someone if they're going to try and kill me because that's a
Yes.
survival instinct. So if he was wrestling, because the hit seems more and more like it just doesn't seem random to me. And I think random is so like they reckon 30% of all or less of all homicides are random. But another point there is like I don't understand how then like when your dad is found, he's slumped over the desk. Like if there was wrestling, that would have been like did the killer put him back at the desk? Was he interrogating him there? Like that's the real thing that doesn't like because just say I'm breaking into a house. I'm going to have to be prepared. Like, I'm not going to waste a lot of time, trying to get into a safe with a head shears. That's
Right.
idiotic. Like, but
Right.
again, maybe this is an idiot criminal, but the fact he hasn't been caught doesn't allude to that too much. But then it's the point of, it's the place in the, like your dad back at the desk. That's one of the strangest parts to me because if there was a wrestling, that would have been out on the floor. Put someone then and moved them at a desk. Yeah, what's your thoughts on that? Like, have you any thoughts on why he was found slumped?
There's a lot that you mentioned that I think is very wise, and there's a lot to unpack. So, first of all, you just start with the statistics. I got contacted by a crime researcher, and he's just a stat guy. He's compiled statistics from all over the United States for a long time. And I don't remember the exact number, but it was something, between 97 and 99%. He said that when an elderly person, a person over 65, is killed in their own home, 97% of the time, it's someone they knew, right? It just like, elderly people are not out there flashing whatever, and they're not getting into passionate arguments. It's usually just somebody that they know. The second piece is, I suppose, again, it is possible that if it was somebody who somehow got in my dad's house, like the car burglar or somebody like that, my dad could have been working at his desk, right? And it's totally possible the guy came up to him, And my dad was like, what are you doing? Right. And then it was like, boom, like in his torso while he was sitting. And then it went into his leg. That would work. Right. And that's why he would have slumped down at his desk. But the detectives have also told me that in a surprisingly high number of these murders, the person places the person once they're murdered. And I didn't even know this. They said that there are murderers who tuck the person into bed. There are murderers who sit the person down. And, something like that to me is a mystery. And I just, it's just, that is something that's fascinating and something I should probably ask the detectives if they have any more insight into. And then the third thing is exactly what you said, right? It's like, it just, no matter how you approach it, it's just the way that the crime scene was and the details we know, it just doesn't make sense. There's very little about this case that makes sense. You could give me any theory and I would give you, so many different holes about it. And again, yeah, like if my dad had come home and like somebody he knew was sitting there and like, doing whatever, he also wouldn't just go sit down, right? Like, so
No.
it's just also weird.
Yeah, like, and sometimes it's, when there's holes and everything, sometimes it's the most obvious, like, thing. Like, it almost, like, and again, I'm no expert. I'm just, like, going off reading a lot of true crime and stuff like that, where it's like, maybe there was someone in the house, but like, then how did they get in? Like, that's the thing. I know there's holes in every part of it. Like, I think to go back, I know you mentioned it like a bit at the top, but like, had your dad any enemies, like anything in the past that would have flagged? Like, I know he was a beloved teacher, an artist. Doesn't seem like it's going to draw a lot of enemies, but like, was there anything in the past that flagged?
No, I mean, if the police, they asked me like, was he dating? Like, is it possible that there was some kind of jilted woman that was upset, or, they looked at everything. My dad was a beloved old man. He was one of these guys who he grew. He had a backyard full of fruit trees. He grew peaches and plums and figs and everything you can imagine. And, he would go take it to the neighbors like, hey, I grew these prize winning figs, and everybody loved him. He had just an army of former students who he had taught who had gone on to great things. Some of them went on to design, really famous cars. Some of them went on to paint presidential portraits. I mean, he had this art, some of them are famous rock stars, right? Because he taught at an art school, and he was so beloved that, we had 1,200 people at his funeral for a church that seats maybe 300, right? And so that was another hard thing, right? Is that I could understand if my dad, was a right-wing talk show host or a left-wing talk show host. I could understand if my dad, was somebody who, was a corporate raider and he was taking over businesses and, putting people out of work. But he was just an old guy who was enjoying retirement. And that's what makes it also so hard to understand.
Was there anything then that, like, that you legislated on, or that was, where like obviously politicians, I know it's probably not as charged back then as it is now, where people have lost their minds around kind of anyone in that political sphere. But like back then, and here's one weird thing I seen on Reddit, and it was a post from like 10 years ago where it's like, they were talking about you, and someone was like, he was like, you were like, not, sorry if I'm going to paraphrase this wrong, but not like pro-gun, but not anti-gun. And we're like, could that have, like, are you voted on some issue? Like, did you have any of these kooks that were like, had a vendetta against you over something? Like, I know it's a wild theory, but
yeah, no, but that is like I said, what I initially thought. I mean, some of that is just natural self-focus. Whenever something like this happens, you tend to be like, wow, like, could I have somehow contributed into this, right? And I definitely, at that moment in time, I did have a lot of kooks who were obsessed with me. There was this piece of legislation that was very, I personally would describe it as very anti-Semitic, anti-Muslim. It wanted to ban circumcision in the state of California. And listen, like I am all for every single parent having a choice. And I made mine when my son was born. But also, you can't like target these old religions and say you can't practice something that's central to your religion. And so I spoke out against it. And for the longest time, I had people showing up to where I was and like throwing what they called foreskin blood on the ground. I mean, you can't make this stuff up, right? And so like I, thought that maybe some of those extremists were upset. There was also a measure, and this is again really crazy, but this is California. There was a measure at the time that I had some issues with that would have required the use of condoms in pornographic movies. And again, I said, well, there's this thing in the United States called the First Amendment. You can't tell people what they have to depict in film. You can't say you must make a state film, right? And so I had killed that bill, and people were very upset. They thought, gee, you're spreading all these diseases if you don't mandate this, right? Which kind of weird. But then also there were some groups that we thought we had caught in voter fraud and stuff. But I guess what I'm trying to say is there's always something when you're in politics. But I just don't think I've actually come to take what the cop said is true. I'm a public guy. My addresses are out there. People could find me at my office. I think if they wanted to send me a message, they probably would have done it another way. But there are still some people who think that this would have been a powerful message that some of these groups could have sent to me.
Powerful message, but there was no kind of I think it would have been a powerful message, but the message wasn't left. It was just unsolved. No,
right. Yeah.
How were you to know? It was if anything, it was just a kind of maybe torture tactic where they not having closure on it.
Yeah.
But Mike, I kind of want to.
I will say this. I mean, one of the possibilities that I've thought of with all of the theories, except for the car burglar, is there are hitmen, and then in Los Angeles there are gang members who will do a hit. Now, obviously, we all have seen too many movies, and we think a professional hitman, he's this sleek guy who's riding a powerboat through the canals of Venice and on an adventure, yeah. Right? But the reality is, my understanding of the underworld in Los Angeles, it's more like gang members who are not that smart. They say, "Oh yeah, I'll do this for $5,000," right? One of the thoughts that has crossed my mind is, what if somebody did hire a hitman? So technically, it was a murder for hire, but the person who they hired was dumb and greedy. And so they got there and they did the job, and they're like, "Oh, well, there's a safe. Let me see if you know what I mean?" And so you could almost combine the theories. You could have a hitman who is also dumb and stupid and high on drugs and greedy and so, doesn't do a good job, right? And then also sits there and tries to get a few more bucks for himself. And so that is something that I have thought about. And that would, if this was a political hit, if this was something else, you still could imagine somebody hiring an imperfect hitman.
Yeah, and I think that's all. You see it here in Ireland when there's a gang violence or there's a hit as well. It's sometimes it's just drug addicts looking for a couple of thousand bucks, and that's what a life boils down to in the end. But I want to kind of stay on because I'd heard on another podcast you were on where you'd mentioned the kind of cooks were coming out of the woodwork, with theories and one this you just said prominent actress had come with number one, maybe give a quick description of what happened there, and then describe how frustrating it must have been getting your hopes up, thinking you were going to get somewhere with a theory or a lead, and then it just falls apart.
Yeah, so that is something in the book that I try to emphasize for my family and also for other victims who go through this. Because, even if your loved one was killed in, gang violence or something, there's always those moments while the case is unsolved where someone says, "Oh, I know who it was. I think it was this person." And that turns out to be a false lead. Well, my father's case, it was very high profile, right? It was national news. It was on Dateline NBC in the United States. It was front page news of the newspapers for months. And then also my job, of course, as a lawmaker was to be as public as possible, right? You want to express your opinion about guns. You want to express your opinion about abortion. Give Mike a call, right? So, my phone number, my email address was very public. And so for whatever reason, high profile killing, Los Angeles, Hollywood, you draw a lot of kooks. And it got to the point where, frankly, for my family, some of this stuff was just cruel. I had a lady who, she called me and she's like, there was a sketch circulated of the car burglar. She's like, "Oh, the car burglar, he's right outside my house right now. You got to come here," right? And so I called the LAPD. I called the chief. They drive over there with sirens blazing, everything like that. And make a long story very short, when they got there, they figured out there was just a homeless guy who was outside her house, and she just wanted to be rid of him really quickly. So she called me and used me and got me to get the full force of the LAPD to drive out there to get this guy away from her house. But one of the most curious calls I got was from a pretty famous soap opera actress who had gone to my father's school. And she had interacted with him, since she left the school and like whatever. And she contacted me and said, "Hey, listen, I have some really, really solid information on your dad's killing. I hope you'll respect me, though. I don't want to give it to you over the phone. I want you to meet me in person, and I'll tell you everything I know." And the demeanor was so calm, and I was like, "Okay, that's reasonable. I could see how people are like that." But then it was like, well, I'm in the capital, which is 300 something miles away, and my schedule's busy. So I was like, okay, so we scheduled lunch, and I think it was like 2 weeks. And I'm like, during those 2 weeks, like I'm like eaten up, and I'm excited, and I'm like, I can't sleep, and I'm like, then I have lunch with her, and like, you see this look in her eye immediately, and she's like, well, yeah, it was Hillary Clinton and this entertainment executive and this and that, and they conspire. And I'm like, well, why? And then she had this other theory that it's like, well, one of them had been her lover and she had tweeted something. And just like, it was so out there. It was so out there. And I actually got a lot of stuff like that. For some reason, this case attracted all of the people who had an agenda or something crazy to say.
Yeah, because man, it's such a storm. Like you're, a prominent figure in politics. It's in Hollywood. It's an unsolved. It's like, yeah, it kind of has all the ingredients going into start to kind of cooks out. But like, did any tip lead to anything? Like, was there anything there where there was a thread or some sort of semblance of intrigue or that it could develop into a bigger lead?
Sure. So that's another thing another point I make in the book is, every police force is different. A lot of times in the United States, we'll have like a small town police detective who has been working on a cold case for 30 years and he's about to retire. And so he goes to the public for help. He goes to genealogists and amateur sleuths and DNA experts, and they finally solve the case. The LAPD is not like that, right? It's a very, very big city department. They're underworked. They're understaffed. There's 4 million people in the city of Los Angeles and 10 million in the surrounding region. And so they're very busy, and 60% of murders go unsolved in Los Angeles City. The LAPD is also, there's like any other organization, there's some good people, there's some not so good people. I have found, it's just my personal experience with this big city police department, is that it's what people in law enforcement call CSI effect. They sit around and they're waiting for like that lab breakthrough that like ties it all up in a bow after an hour. It's like, oh, we have DNA and we got a hit and like this was it. And it, the old fashioned police sleuthing just doesn't happen anymore. And so I felt like that fell on me. But your question was, this is a big lead up to say that there was somebody who lived, maybe her house was 200 feet, 100 feet from my father's. She lived behind his across the street neighbor. And I just started asking people in the neighborhood, and somebody connected me with her, and they said, well, you know what? She heard a gunshot. She heard a gunshot at, I forget the time, but it was way different from the official timeline. And to me, that was like very relevant. And I grilled her. I said, how do you know for sure that it was at, 6 o'clock and not 7:30? She said, well, because I took my son to a language class in this part of the city every time, and we left at precisely this time so we wouldn't be late, and it happened at precisely this time. How do you know it was a gunshot? Are you sure it was a gunshot? She's like, Mike, I dropped down and hid and cowered for like 5 minutes. And I'm like, okay, like, yeah, that's kind of legit, right? Like if it's like a car backfire, like people don't do that. And so that threw sort of a wrench in the timeline. I mentioned it to the detectives and they're like, well, we'll talk to her, and it's just, that type of thing is hard, right? Because you want the detectives considering the case to think of everything and to look at every angle, because again, as we've gone through, little tiny subtle differences can mean you can take this theory and you can just, you can put it to bed. You can say it's conclusively not the car burglar, right? And so that's something that has been difficult.
Yeah, I can imagine, because it's kind of threads. And I think what makes it more difficult is everything as a whole. There's no kind of concrete like theory which you can really cling to. I suppose one area that we kind of probably haven't explored there is like, and you look at, like you mentioned Dateline, you mentioned any of these shows, like so many times it goes back to money, or it goes back to like, there's a greed motive. Like, without, and again, tell me to shut up if I'm drawing across the line, but like in terms of coming to like motive around like wills or around money or anything like that, like has that been explored? I know that's very uncomfortable because you're going to like obviously in talking about your family, but like where did any of that get investigated?
Yes, it did and it didn't, right? I mean, I know what I've been able to piece together, and I know what has been publicly reported in newspapers and things like that. So my father was rewriting his estate plan when he was killed, and he was changing it fairly drastically from what we know. And the possibility has been raised that that had something to do with it. The second thing, that has been publicly reported, and this was some newspaper did some digging, and the family was not aware, right, is that one of my sisters, I have two sisters, that one of my sisters, my older sister, got married a few hours before my dad was killed. And nobody in the family was invited or knew about it or attended. And that is something that, of course, people have pointed out as a big coincidence. But my approach to it has been this. I've said two things since the beginning. Number one, I would not be a faithful son to my father if I did not tell the police to explore every lead, no matter how painful they might be, to think about. They got to explore everything. They got to leave no stone unturned. They got to consider everything. That's their job. The second thing is, at the same time, and I talk about this a little bit in the book, we also have to be very careful, because if this was just a very, very unfortunate coincidence, if this was something that, could very easily be pointed to, we have to be careful for one practical reason. And the detectives have mentioned this to me too. At some point in my father's case, we hope and pray there will be an arrest. Okay. And that person has to decide if they want to go to trial. The standard in the United States is beyond a reasonable doubt. And it is very, very, very common for the defense attorney to just talk about somebody else, to say, well, so let's say at some point they arrest the car burglar and they say it's him. Well, if we go too deep down another theory that seems so coincidental or so logical, he might not get convicted, and vice versa. Vice versa. If I went out there and was like, oh, it's definitely, the car burglar, and they arrest like one of my father's friends, it was like, well, but you said that like this is all fits this way. And so it's been very, very, very hard. There was a hybrid theory that a reporter, a journalist mentioned to me that I think, again, is one of the most fascinating. My sister did have a key to my father's house, and her boyfriend, now husband, did too. Like we just talked, they got married a few hours before my dad was killed. This journalist said, well, isn't it just possible that they had some friends who were maybe not that, that were kind of underbelly or just not that great, and they went and took the key from their house? Like, well, they're going to be at a wedding, they're going to be busy, and their dad is of course going to be at the wedding because he's their dad. And then they just went and thought that they would hit up a house because everybody would be at the wedding. Well, of course, that would be a totally innocent theory that would tie everything together, right? And then, but the big hitch in that, of course, is that my dad wasn't at the wedding, and that's why he was caught there, and that it could have been an accidental thing. So it's tough. All of these theories are so tough. They're tough to think about. They're tough to consider, and each one has, a little bit of a hole. So, but I just want the police to consider everything possible.
Yeah, I think that's the best philosophy to go into it with, like complete openness. But like the effect on your family, like, how has this affected your relationship with your sisters, with your, I know with your wife, I know your eldest daughter was very young at the time, but she did have a relationship with her granddad. But like, how has it affected the kind of whole sphere of your family?
Great question. So what I always tell people is that a murder like this tears a family apart.
Yeah, I can imagine.
It did in several ways. So for the first couple of years after my dad was killed, I was not a good friend to my friends. I was not a good husband to my wife. I was not a good, I worked very hard to not let it affect my job as a lawmaker, but there were days where, you don't feel like doing much other than obsessing about the latest clue. And so I know that for the first, maybe 2 years after the crime, I was very distracted. And to me, that I still have guilt for that, with respect to just not being that available for my friends who needed me. And, I tried to be present for my family, but again, I know that I probably wasn't there on certain days where I was obsessing. The second thing is, how it affected my relationship with the rest of my family. It tore us apart. I mean, my dad did not expect to die. And so his estate plan, which he was redoing, was a total mess. He hadn't updated it for years. It had been like decades, right? And so, or about a decade. And so, it was like you take the chaos of a murder and then the chaos of somebody not having their affairs in order. And it's like, whoa, everybody doesn't know what to do. And so the civil aspect of the case, as opposed to the criminal aspect, was also really hard on his nuclear family. And then finally, my daughter, Eliana, she goes by Elle. This was very, very hard on her because she had such a strong relationship with me. And then I was, pulled back naturally from certain things. But then she really, really loved my dad. She bonded with him very, very closely. She kind of viewed him as like an older, gentler, more patient version of me, right? And so he was teaching her how to paint, which I could never do. He was, really, really took a very close interest in her, and they had a bond. And I think losing him was very hard for her. And then, for my other children, right, who didn't know him well, I mean, my son wasn't born yet, and my other daughter was very young. They just lost a grandfather. It's something intangible that they will never know, but he was such a doting grandfather. They lost a lot of trips of ice cream and a lot of painting lessons and probably some financial support. But all the important things that come from having a grandfather like my dad, they lost. And so it's very, very, very hard on the family.
Lost, but like taken. Like, the thing is, like, if my granddad's died naturally, two of them died actually of heart attacks. But like, I can say, they were lost. But like, for your children, their grandfather was taken. Like, it was taken from them. Like, it wasn't a natural thing. So I can imagine it's even a tougher. It's so sudden. And then, it probably, part of your book is talking about, this kind of darkness released in you, but like for all involved.
Yeah. And that's a point that I make too in the book, is that the thing about murder, right, that is so different is, look, there's people who die of sudden heart attacks, and I'm sorry about that, and that's never, it's when you lose a loved one, it's never easy. But most people, when they lose a loved one, if you found out that your grandmother got cancer today, God forbid, she, you'd have maybe 2 years, and you'd make sure that she got her affairs in order and that she would tell you all the stories you always never asked her before. And she could have conversations with you like, hey, just don't forget, like when I did this when you were like 17, I loved you so much and I'm so sorry. I mean, with my father, with murders, it's like they're there one day and they're gone the next. I never got a chance to ask my dad a lot of things. I never got a chance to have conversations about things that I wanted to talk about. And that is what is just so weird. It's like, I think my last interaction with him is like, I called his voicemail and I'm like, hey, I need a plumber recommendation, and it's so banal, but then, then the next day he's gone. And it's just very hard. That's what a murder is. It's just a jolt in your life that is just very sudden.
Sudden and tragic, and then it's the not knowing, why or what was the motive. Just when you said plumber there, it just kind of piqued with me. Like, was there anyone that, like the TV repairman, was there anything scheduled like the week before? Anyone that was in the house, maybe a maintenance, gardener?
Yeah, I mean, I think the police checked out my father's gardener, and maybe his crew. I don't know. I mean, that is obviously, that could be one of the theories that we're not necessarily thinking about. Somebody kind of had a sense of what he had in there and kind of, wasn't that professional and so on and so forth. Totally possible, right? Totally, completely possible. But I think they did a pretty decent job of checking everything out. My dad wasn't really like that. I mean, he did most of the stuff inside of his house by himself. And I can tell you one thing, he never let anybody into his bedroom. He just didn't. He let family members in there, but there is no way that a guest would have been allowed into his bedroom. He was a very private person. And that's just not something you do. When you come to someone's house, you don't come sit in my bedroom, right? So it just, that part also is very, very strange.
Definitely. Just because I know we'll wrap up soon. We're on a deadline, but did you get a PI involved or like that kind of second eye?
I did. I hired a private investigator. He had actually some pretty good stuff that he came up with. The LAPD was not happy. Here's this guy, right? I'm in office. I'm friends with the mayor of Los Angeles. I'm friends with the police chief. And I felt like sometimes in the investigation, the LAPD got a little upset at me because I pushed so hard. I also say that I couldn't help it, right? I mean, first of all, it's my father. And secondly, I would go to an event and I would be giving a speech and the mayor would be right next to me giving a speech. And then when we were done, he would say, "Hey, Mike, how's the case going?" And I would say, "Well, not that great," right? But somehow that would, go down the chain of command and they would take it as a criticism of them. But the case is just not solved. And I can't lie to the mayor. I'm not going to say, "Well, it's great." The private investigator was a little helpful, but I think that angered the LAPD a little bit, but it is what it is.
Yeah. I'm just going to sum it up here because, like all the listeners, do your thing if you're into kind of true crime or take a look. Definitely read Mike's book, Noir by Necessity. Like I will link it and all below. But to summarise what we know, okay? So, your dad was murdered in his home. He was found, slumped over his desk. There was a gunshot wound to his abdomen, went into his thigh. There wasn't a whole lot of blood pooled. His filing cabinet and safe. His filing cabinet was rifled through. The safe was kind of butchered with a shears, but wasn't got into. There wasn't much valuables taken from the home. Reports of a car burglar around that was kind of dressed almost as an Eastern Europe hitman. There was theories then around, Russian mob involvement over paintings, but they remained on the wall. There was DNA found at the scene, but the DNA hasn't flagged in POTUS or whatever not POTUS, but whatever the system they use, which is very, odd if you imagine this is a kind of career criminal that would be in burgling houses. So there's so much information here, and it's just trying to piece it together in the right way. And maybe, look, some listeners, this has a big reach in the US, this podcast. There might be I'll actually try to get a way to put up the sketch as well. You just never know. I think I'll put that out maybe on a short. But, anything I missed there, anything you want to add to that as well? There's a lot of threads. We're just not finding a way to tie them together maybe.
Well, a couple things. So first of all, I thank everybody out there for their interest. This is what keeps crimes it just reminds police forces everywhere that there's a family and there's a community that cares around the world about bringing justice, right? And so that is something I thank everybody for. And the second thing is, as you said, this show has a lot of reach. And, if this was the young man, the young man who was breaking into cars, somebody knows something, right? That night, somebody might be like, well, yeah, there's a kid who lived next to me, a couple blocks from your dad. And he came home that night and he was in a pool of sweat and then he moved to Georgia. Okay, well, yeah, that could explain a lot, right? So if somebody knows anything, please let us know. You can find me pretty easily online, and we appreciate everybody doing whatever they can.
Definitely. And did I see, is there a reward for, was that?
Yeah.
Maybe? Yeah.
There's a reward. There's a $50,000 reward that leads to the conviction of whoever killed my dad.
Perfect. So like when I'm putting a short out, I'll put up that sketch, hopefully someone knows something. But, look, Mike, thanks so much for coming on, sharing your story and sharing your dad's story. Kind of, it's a nice way, I think, to remember him, even though it's a grim way. But we're still able to share like the details of who he was as a person, and his life that isn't just tethered to his tragic murder. So, like, I know these conversations can be definitely difficult for you. So, hats off to you, man, for coming out, trying to get that awareness out, trying to get justice for your dad. It's really admirable.
Thank you so much for having me and for all you do.
Thanks a million, Mike. Cheers.
Cheers.